Thank you all for joining us here today. In 1983, Ronald Reagan remarked, "The people who disagree with our side rebuilding its military security don't seem to understand. Our side is the only side where people are permitted to disagree, and that should make them nervous. It isn't America that attacks and occupies other countries. We conduct no worldwide campaign of subversion and terrorism. We don't have to build walls to keep our people in, or use armies of secret police and Gulag prison camps to keep them quiet. We're a free people, a democratic people. We believe in God, and we love peace." We're here today in the galleries within the Reagan Museum that address this campaign of subversion and terrorism and oppression of freedom to unveil a new exhibit called the Gulag Collection. This magnificent artwork was painted by Nikolai Gman, who in 1946 was imprisoned in the Soviet Union's Gulag for 8 years, simply for witnessing another artist draw a caricature of Stalin on a cigarette paper. Although he survived the Gulag, the horrors were seared into his memory of the horrendous life and death inflicted on so many millions of innocent people. Over 4 decades, Nikolai painted portraits to tell this story, one of the few artists who recorded the life of prisoners in the Gulag. These are some of those paintings. It's a rather large collection, and we wish we had more space, but we're very fortunate to have this. Unfortunately, Nikolai passed away in 2004. And as I said, we are fortunate to have this, and right now I want to thank the collections team, and especially Jennifer, for pulling this all together. In just a few minutes, I'm going to introduce Lee Edwards here. He's already expressed his thanks to me. Really, I think he was very impressed, more impressed than he thought he was going to be when he walked in here, so I want to thank the team. And as I said, we do have a good friend of ours with us today, Dr. Lee Edwards. Lee is the Distinguished Fellow in Conservative Thought at the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics, and he's the Heritage Foundation's in-house authority on the U.S. conservative movement. We'll have a conversation with him later today on what happened last night. He has authored or edited at least 20 books, one on the essential Ronald Reagan. Lee is also chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and has spoken at the Reagan Library before, most notably last season on our Berlin Wall conference on the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Lee?
Well, thank you, Joanne, and Jennifer, thank you. This is magnificent. It is so moving and so touching to see what you've done in presenting these, and I know that Nikolai Gman, if you were here, would love it and would thank you all as well. So thank you on behalf of myself and the Heritage Foundation for what you've done. As Joanne said, the Gulag Collection is a group of 50 paintings of the Soviet slave labor camp system by the Ukrainian artist and Gulag survivor Nikolai Gman. So from 1945 to 1953, Gman spent 8 years in Siberia as a political prisoner and then worked for 40 years in secret and from memory to create this unique chronicle of life and death in the Gulag. He was a professional artist. He dared tell no one what he was doing, not even his wife, for fear that the KGB would seize the paintings and put him back in the Gulag. One expert has called the Gulag Collection a visual counterpart to Alexander Solzhenitsyn's epic work, The Gulag Archipelago. The word Gulag only became known around the world in 1973 with the publication of the Gulag Archipelago. According to the British historian Robert Conquest, the material that Solzhenitsyn collected on Solzhenitsyn himself was a survivor of the Gulag, proved final and decisive to a wide readership that had not until then really assimilated the realities of the Gulag. Of the Gulag collection of paintings, Conquest says, Nikolai Gman shows a world of hunger and deprivation and oppression with extraordinary clarity and vision. In his paintings, one can see the whole perspective of what the Soviet government itself described as a system in which death was caused by unbearable toil, by cold and starvation, by unheard of degradation and humiliation, by a life that could not have been endured by any other animal. What was the Gulag? Well, here's how the historian Anne Applebaum describes it. It was a vast network of forced labor camps, slave labor camps really, 1,000 of them, that stretched across the Soviet Union from central Moscow to the plains of Central Asia to the frozen tundra of Siberia. It included labor camps, punishment camps, criminal and political camps, women's camps, even children's camps. The first Gulag camps were opened in the summer of 1918 under Lenin, and were not closed finally and permanently until the 1980s under Gorbachev. The Gulag reached its grotesque apex in the early 1950s under Joseph Stalin, rightly called a monster by conquest. Lenin and the first Bolsheviks used the camps to rehabilitate so-called enemies of the people. But starting in 1929, the Soviet secret police took control of the entire Soviet penal system, including the Gulag, and Stalin used the Gulag then as an economic instrument as well as a means of punishment. Prisoners, political as well as criminal, were forced to work in almost every Soviet industry, including gold mining in the Kolyma complex in the far northeastern corner of Siberia, and Nikolai Gman was an inmate, a zek, in Kolyma. An estimated 29 million people passed through the Gulag camps and settlements. We have no accurate figures of how many died in the camps, but a conservative estimate is that 1/4 to 1/3 of the inmates died, as many as died in the Nazi concentration camps. But even such horrendous figures cannot convey the full impact of the Gulag on Soviet society. Consider, a man is tried and sent to the Gulag as an enemy of the people. His wife is taken to a Gulag camp because she is a member of an enemy's family. His children grow up in orphanages and join criminal gangs. His mother dies of stress and grief. His cousins and aunts and uncles cut off all contact with each other to avoid being tainted and targeted for imprisonment. Hovering over every family and every individual in the Soviet Union for more than 4 decades was the specter of the Gulag. Well, what was life in the Gulag like? Particularly in the Siberian camp of Kolyma, where Nikolai Gman was. Imagine that you wake up in a small wooden barracks with 20 other prisoners. It's 6 a.m. You've been sleeping on a wooden bunk on a thin mattress stuffed with straw. You've slept in your pants and your shirt and your shoes and socks with the padded overcoat pulled over your head because it's 40 degrees below zero outside. And there's a white cobweb of frost along the inside of the barracks where the walls join the ceiling. The only heat comes from a small coal stove, stone cold. In a few minutes, a fellow prisoner will bring in breakfast, 6 ounces of bread about the size of your fist, and a small bowl of thin, lukewarm gruel. You eat half the bread and save the other half for later when you're hungry, and you're always hungry in the Gulag. You pick out your felt boots from a pile on the floor, and you're about to start your workday, 12 to 14 hours long, digging in a coal mine. You take a short break at midday and eat that piece of bread that you saved and some more gruel. Guards are nearby, so you're very careful what you say, because punishment for subversive activities can include a smaller food rationing, a more difficult work assignment, and even execution. At dusk, when you're so tired you can barely lift your shovel or your feet, the guards finally let you stop, and you file back to the barracks, 5 men across, where you're given another piece of bread and some thin vegetable soup with a fish bone if you're lucky. You fall exhausted on your wooden bunk and say to yourself, well, I'm still alive. One day gone, another 3,254 days to go in the forced labor camp of Kolyma in the Gulag. This was the life of the political prisoner Nikolai Gman from 1945 to 1953. And his crime, as Joanne has said, that he was present when another artist, a fellow artist, drew a satirical cartoon of Joseph Stalin on a cigarette box. An informer reported them. And Nikolai was sentenced for anti-Soviet activity to 10 years imprisonment and 5 years suppression of civil rights for something he didn't do. And there was no appeal. Gman explained that at Kolyma, he was always on my guard, but the main thing is, I would not have survived without the belief, the absolute conviction that good would triumph over evil. Nothing could convince me that Bolshevism, the plague of the 20th century, would reign unchecked in Russia. He drew one specific conclusion from his experience. There's a human virtue called strength of will, and I realize what a great unbending force it is if even the terrible Gulag machine could not extinguish it. Each of us is responsible for the future, Gman said, and because of this responsibility, I cannot be silent. And this Gulag collection attests beyond doubt that Nikolai Gman is an eloquent spokesman for the undying spirit of man. The people like Nikolai Gman sought the freedom to speak and write and paint and choose their job and go to church. But such freedoms were denied them by the Soviet regime. And if they tried to exercise these freedoms, they were arrested and convicted as enemies of the people and sent to the Gulag for 10, 20, 30 years. And many were not so lucky. They were executed by a totalitarian regime that did not expect or accept any deviation from the norm laid down by the Communist Party. Through the generosity of the Jamestown Foundation, the Heritage Foundation is now the owner of the Gulag collection, which is being exhibited at various foreign embassies in Washington, D.C., and here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library for the next several months. Asked why he had done the paintings, Nikolai Gman, who died in 2004, said this: I undertook the task because I was convinced that it was my duty to leave behind a testimony to the fate of the millions of prisoners who died and who should not be forgotten. And because of Nikolai's perseverance and talent, we have this stunning visual chronicle of the Gulag, an indelible reminder of the men and women who lived and died and survived in the largest prison history in human history. As for the paintings, let me quote the art historian Alla Rogers. The palette that Gman uses often conveys the eerie glow of searchlights at night, of truck convoys traveling at night, the poorly lit barracks, and the fetid gray-green tedium of the day-by-day ordeal of sheer survival. The colors of winter on the permafrost of Siberia dominate, gray snow and grayer slush, populated by hollow-eyed, bony figures, equally gray. These are not pretty paintings. The most poignant depict life among prisoners in the critical moments of their fragile existence. And I close with these words of Nikolai Gman. I dedicate my collection to the memory of those who survived the Gulag and to those who did not. Light a candle in their memory. The living are in need of it more than the dead. Bow your heads. Thank you.
Thank you. I think yet one more testimony that we live in the greatest country on earth. I now declare this temporary exhibit open. I encourage all of you to take a few moments so that you'll know what we have here, what we are privileged to be able to display here, so that you can share it with all of our visitors. Oh, sure. Are you willing?
Sure, of course.
Leah is willing to take some questions, so here's your chance.
Yes, ma'am.
Are any of these figures self-portrait?
Yes, they are. This up here is Gman on the day of his release, the one right there. And that is his certificate that he was given declaring he was no longer an enemy of the people. And this is Nikolai here. You can see right here in the center. And let me see. I think that is the only one where he's singled out. Or this may also. That may be Nikolai there as well. I met him only once in about as I told Joanne, about 1997. It was briefly, this collection was briefly shown at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Nikolai Gman was there. He was an extraordinary figure, looking very like this, with this white beard, white hair, very strong man. But I think it was his spiritual strength which enabled him to live and to survive that terrible experience. Yes, sir.
You said that it was 40 years he kept these hidden.
Yes.
At what point did he release them? Why and how was that?
Right. In the early 90s, he had finished these paintings, and this was after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the fall of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which is December of 91. And he was still nervous, though. He was saying, oh, what is going to happen to these? He was getting along in years, and he was fearful that someone would come along and destroy them, or capture them, or seize them. And so he sent out the word, I really want to get these paintings out of Russia and to the West. And at that point, the Jamestown Foundation, which had very good contacts with Russian emigres and dissidents, heard about this and managed to persuade one of their supporters to buy the paintings from Nikolai, providing him with a means of living for the rest of his life, brought the paintings to America with his blessing and with his approval.
So there was no issue with getting them out of the country?
Because by that time,
Legal issue at that point?
Boris Yeltsin was the president. There was a period of somewhat freedom of thought and expression, opening up the archives of the Kremlin, the KGB, and so forth. So at that particular moment, that was the right time to get them out. What that would be the case today under Vladimir Putin, we're not so sure. Yes, sir.
What was the total number of paintings?
50. There are 50 paintings, and there have been one or two of the embassies in Washington, D.C., which have been able to take on 50 paintings. That's a lot of painting, and as you can see, they're all of considerable size. They're extraordinary. Yes, ma'am.
After he was released, was he able to reunite with his family and where did he live?
He was living in Kharkov, which is a city now in Ukraine, was his hometown, actually. And so during that period there, when he was painting, he was reunited with his wife. He spent several years in Siberia, then came back to Ukraine in the 90s, and then lived the rest of his life there in Kharkov. His son is living actually in America right now. Yes, sir.
His name is not Russian, it's German original.
I'm sorry?
His name is not Russian.
That's because he was Ukrainian, really, more than he was Russian.
Not a Ukrainian name either.
Uh-huh.
They gotta be German. All the German is Ukraine.
Right.
You know, it could be Jewish also.
Yeah, he was Jewish. He was Jewish. Yes. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
How long is this flight going to be here?
At least a couple of months. We don't have an end date yet, but we're going to work with Lee. We'll leave it here as long as we can, and hopefully we'll have a lot of students as well as adults that will come through and really enjoy it.
We speaking for Heritage, we can't think of a better place for these paintings to be than here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library for all the obvious reasons. The reference, I mean, the president knew so much about the Gulag, wrote about it, understood its importance, its significance. So to us, it's just a perfect marriage. So we're in no hurry, Joanne.
Neither are we.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Didn't get missed on me that Mr. Stalin is right above us.
Right. Yes. Yes, way in the back. Yes, sir.
Are these reprints or are these the?
These are the original paintings. You're looking at the original paintings here. There's been some talk about whether or not we should do some prints of some of the paintings, particularly the one there of the cross and the skulls. So we may look at that perhaps. But these are the original paintings done by Nikolai Gman in secret in a small little studio which he had in the back of his home in Kharkov. And as he said, he was afraid to tell even his wife about it. So it really, truly was an extraordinary secret that he kept all these time. Yes, sir.
Yes, in the self-portrait upon his release,
Yes.
what does the sign that's upside down say? What is the significance of it?
You mean here? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. But I will find out the answer. Right. I will find out. Yes.
If we go on our computer and Google, can we see all 50?
Yes. Yes, you may. Indeed. And they're at good resolution, too. Yes, ma'am.
How did he hide them?
Well, keep in mind that Nikolai was a professional artist, and during this period, he got out in the 50s and he came back to Kharkov in late 50s, early 60s. He was doing portraits to stay alive of communists. I mean, he was doing portraits of Brezhnev, and people didn't do one of Stalin. He wouldn't go quite that far. And so he was an artist, and so there were always these canvases and things which are stuck over in the corner there and so forth. So late at night, he would come out and, by candlelight almost, maybe that's one reason why the lighting of these are so extraordinary, and then would work on these paintings, then cover them up as soon as he got through, stuck them off in the corner there. And he just did that for decades, so no one could tell what he was doing. Way in the back.
Has anything like this been shown in Russia? And what is the current situation today on how they treat this part of their history? I ask because they have different interpretations every year of what Victory Day means and whether they show Stalin or not.
That's a wonderful question, and as I mentioned earlier, we've had this exhibition at various embassies, foreign embassies in Washington, D.C., the Czechs, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Slovaks, Romanians, and so forth. We went to the Russians and said, "Would you like to have this?" And they said, "Yes." And so I thought, "Oh, that's extraordinary. Here we are. We'll be able to really show this to them at the Russian Cultural Center." And I'll never forget, I sat down with the director of the Russian Cultural Center, and we had this catalog, and all the paintings were there, all 50 of them in full color. And we went through and I said, "Which ones do you like? Which ones would you like of the 50? And he picked every last one that depicted birds flying and the spring is coming, and none, not the Golgotha one, not of any of the terrible ones of what life was really like in the Gulag. And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, we can't have that. That's not keeping faith with the spirit of this collection." And I suggested we should have these paintings and these and these and these. And they said, "Well, we'll get back to you." and they never got back to me. So that to me is an indication they are still unwilling to accept what was happening in Russia all of those years under the communists. Some of these paintings were shown in Kharkov, in Ukraine, but only very briefly. And when I asked, again, this director, Russian gentleman, is Gutman known? So, oh, yes, we know about him. There's wonderful portraits that he did of Brezhnev and so forth and all the rest of it, but not these paintings. So these are still not really truly known in Russia, which is tragic, because they must, accept history, and part of history is the Gulag for them.
One more thing, are you aware, this was not only Soviet Union, but also all Eastern European countries copy the same thing? They have this kind of forced labor camp.
Oh, yes, yeah, right, yeah. And as a matter of fact, the largest slave labor camp, there still is one today in China. It's called the Laogai, Laogai. And there are hundreds of, again, forced labor camps in China right today. They don't want to talk about it, but they're there. And that's something else that needs to be part of history, to accept what has really been the reality of life in China as well as in Russia.
Okay, this will be our last
One more question.
Do you know what happened to the 1,000 Gulag work camps?
Yeah.
Now are they using them for, what are they using them for?
Yeah, we're producing a virtual exhibit about life in the Gulag, and that will be shown starting in June. And for those of you, we'll have to make sure that you know about that, and we'll let you know about that, Joanne, for those who might be interested. And in the course of creating, so it's going to be online, you'll be able to sit there and virtually visit a Gulag camp and a Gulag barracks and get a feel of what it was like. When we went to Russia, and friends of ours have done this, most of them are gone. They just have disappeared. There are just a half a dozen or so of these camps which are still around. And one or two of them have been turned into museums, but only one or two out of the 1,000 original camps. Well, thank you all so very much indeed.
Thank you. Lee told me this morning that Heritage is sending us a large collection of pamphlets that we'll make available in this gallery for our visitors. I know that our docents will be happy to hear that, as well as the catalog, so that we can all review all of the paintings that are in the collection and have a better understanding of what we aren't able to display here. So take a moment and take a look, and Lee will be here for a little while longer if you do have other questions that you want to ask him. Thank you all for coming this morning.